My girlfriend's parents pretended to be racist to test my values, so I pretended to agree and watched them backtrack in horror. Maya and I had been dating for 7 months when she finally invited me to meet her parents at their house for dinner. She'd been nervous about it for weeks, making excuses about their schedules being crazy or the timing not being right. On the drive to their place in the suburbs, she gripped the steering wheel so hard her knuckles went white. "I need to warn you about something," she said quietly. "My parents can be intense. They have strong opinions and they're not always tactful about expressing them." I told her I could handle intense and squeezed her hand reassuringly. What I didn't know was that I was walking into a performance designed to expose the worst version of myself. Her parents' house was a sprawling colonial in an upscale neighborhood where every lawn looked professionally maintained. Maya's mother, Vivian, answered the door wearing pearls and a cardigan that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She looked me up and down with an expression I couldn't quite read before pulling me into a stiff hug. "You must be Julian," she said in a voice that was friendly but felt practiced. "We've heard so much about you." Her father, Gerald, appeared behind her, tall and imposing in a polo shirt and khakis, extending his hand for a firm handshake that lasted a beat too long. Come in, dinner's almost ready." The house smelled like roasted chicken and expensive candles. The living room was decorated in that tasteful, wealthy way where everything matched perfectly, and nothing looked actually lived in. Family photos covered the mantel showing Maya at various stages of childhood, always smiling in front of expensive vacation destinations. Gerald gestured for me to sit in an oversized leather chair while he poured drinks from a crystal decanter. "Scotch?" he asked, and I accepted even though I preferred beer. Maya sat on the couch next to her mother, her leg bouncing anxiously. Vivian asked the standard getting-to-know-you questions about my job as a graphic designer and where I grew up. I answered honestly, explaining I'd grown up in a working-class neighborhood on the other side of the city and had put myself through community college before transferring to finish my degree. Gerald made a non-committal sound and took a long sip of his drink. Dinner was served in a formal dining room with place settings that included more forks than I knew what to do with. The food was excellent, but the conversation quickly took a turn that made my stomach clench. Gerald asked what I thought about the recent protests downtown, and I said I supported people's right to demonstrate peacefully for racial justice. Vivian's face shifted into something cold. "Peaceful," she repeated with a bitter laugh. "You call burning buildings and looting stores peaceful?" I started to explain that the vast majority of protests had been peaceful and that violence was escalating situations, but Gerald cut me off. "The problem is, these people don't respect law and order. They want handouts instead of working for what they have." The way he emphasized these people made his meaning crystal clear. I felt Maya's hand find mine under the table, squeezing so hard it almost hurt. Her eyes were pleading with me to just let it go, to not engage, but I couldn't sit there and smile through bigotry. I said that systemic racism was real and that people were rightfully angry about centuries of injustice. Vivian made a dismissive gesture with her wine glass. "Systemic racism is just an excuse for personal failure. My family came to this country with nothing, and we built ourselves up through hard work. Nobody gave us anything." I pointed out that her family's experience as white immigrants was fundamentally different from the Black American experience of slavery, Jim Crow, and ongoing discrimination. Gerald's face flushed red. "So you're one of those white guilt liberals who thinks we should apologize for being successful?" he asked sharply. The dinner continued in this vein for another excruciating hour. Every topic somehow circled back to their racist talking points. They complained about diversity initiatives at their companies, made comments about crime in black neighborhoods, and suggested that if people just followed the law, they wouldn't have problems with police. Maya barely spoke, picking at her food and looking like she wanted to disappear into the floor. I tried several times to push back on their statements with facts and data, but they dismissed everything as liberal propaganda or biased media. By the time dessert was served, I was furious and confused. Maya had described her parents as loving and progressive. This version of them seemed like caricatures of racist uncles you avoid at Thanksgiving. After dinner, Maya excused us quickly, claiming she had an early morning the next day. Her parents hugged her goodbye, but their farewell to me was notably cooler. Gerald said he hoped I'd think about what they'd discussed, and Vivian added that she hoped next time I'd be more open-minded. In the car, Maya burst into tears. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed. "I didn't know they were going to be like that. I've never heard them talk that way before." I was so shocked and upset for her that I didn't stop to wonder why parents who'd never expressed racist views before would suddenly become so vocal about them in front of their daughter's new boyfriend. I just held her hand and told her it wasn't her fault, that we didn't have to see them again if she didn't want to. She nodded but looked conflicted, and I realized this was going to be more complicated than I'd thought. Over the next week, Maya seemed distant and stressed. She said her parents were calling constantly, asking questions about me and our relationship. They want to have us over again, she said one night as we lay in bed. They said they want to apologize and get to know you better. I was skeptical, but Maya looked so hopeful that I agreed. The second dinner was scheduled for the following Saturday, and I spent the week mentally preparing myself to maintain composure no matter what they said. What I didn't prepare for was discovering that the entire first dinner had been an elaborate test, and that my reasonable responses had somehow failed me. I also didn't prepare for what I was about to do in response. The night before the second dinner, I was having drinks with my best friend Luis when I vented about the situation. He listened to the whole story and then leaned back with a thoughtful expression. "Man, that sounds like a test," he said. "Rich white parents testing whether their daughter's boyfriend is woke enough?" I laughed it off initially, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Maya's description of her parents as progressive hadn't matched their behavior at all. Her shock at their statements had seemed genuine, but also somewhat performative, and the convenient invitation for a do-over dinner felt orchestrated. I pulled out my phone and started searching, finding Vivian's LinkedIn profile showing her position on the board of several non-profit organizations focused on racial equity. Gerald's company bio highlighted his work mentoring minority entrepreneurs. These weren't people who actually held the beliefs they'd expressed. I felt anger rising in my chest, but it was mixed with something else. A cold, calculating part of my brain started turning over possibilities. If they wanted to test me, I could test them right back. I could show them exactly how dangerous it was to play-act bigotry, how easily those performances could be taken at face value and used against them. Luis saw the change in my expression. "Whatever you're thinking, I'm here for it," he said with a grin. I spent the rest of the night planning, and by the time I kissed Maya goodnight, I had a strategy that would either blow up spectacularly or teach her parents a lesson they'd never forget. I texted Maya that I was actually looking forward to dinner, which was true for reasons she couldn't possibly understand. Saturday arrived, and I dressed carefully in slacks and a button-down, the costume of a reasonable young man meeting his girlfriend's parents. Maya picked me up, and during the drive, she kept reminding me that her parents wanted to apologize and start over. "They feel terrible about last time," she said. Mom was crying on the phone about how they'd given me the wrong impression. I made appropriately forgiving sounds while my mind raced through the script I'd prepared. When we pulled up to the house, I took a deep breath and committed fully to the role I was about to play. Vivian and Gerald greeted us at the door with warm smiles and profuse apologies. "Julian, we owe you an explanation," Vivian started, but I held up my hand. "Actually, I owe you an apology," I said, watching their faces register confusion. "I've been doing a lot of thinking this week, and I realize I was being defensive the other night. You were just being honest about the reality of things." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Maya's hand tightened on my arm. "Julian, what are you talking about?" she asked slowly. I turned to her parents, who were staring at me with expressions I couldn't quite read. "You were right about the protests," I continued. "I've been reading some different perspectives online, and I can see how the media has been lying to us about what's really happening. These riots are getting out of control, and it's because people don't want to take personal responsibility anymore." Gerald's mouth opened and closed like a fish. Maya made a small sound of distress. I pushed forward. "And you know what? I grew up around those neighborhoods you were talking about. I've seen firsthand how some cultures just don't value education and hard work the way they should. My own mother used to say the same things." Vivian's face had gone pale. "Julian," she started, but I was on a roll now. I spent the next 10 minutes performing the most casually racist monologue I could construct while maintaining plausible deniability. I peppered it with phrases like, "I'm not racist, but," and "I have black friends, however," the kind of statements that bigots use as shields. I talked about personal responsibility and crime statistics and how, maybe if people just complied with police, they wouldn't get hurt. I repeated back every single talking point Gerald and Vivian had made at the first dinner, but with added enthusiasm and fake personal anecdotes. I watched their horror grow with each sentence. Maya had pulled away from me and was staring like she'd never seen me before. Gerald kept trying to interrupt to say they'd been wrong, that they'd reconsidered, but I steamrolled over him. "You opened my eyes," I told him earnestly. "I was being too liberal, too naive. You showed me the truth." Vivian finally found her voice. "Julian, stop. Please stop. We were wrong. Everything we said at that first dinner was wrong, and we didn't actually believe any of it." Her voice was shaking. Maya turned to her mother slowly. "What do you mean you didn't believe it?" she asked with dangerous quiet. Vivian looked between us, clearly panicking. "It was a test," she admitted. "We wanted to see if Julian would stand up to racist views, if he'd defend his values even when it was uncomfortable. We've done it with all your boyfriends, sweetheart. We needed to know what kind of person he really was. Maya's face went from confused to furious in an instant, but I wasn't done yet. I laughed, a genuine sound of disbelief. A test. You were testing me by pretending to be racist. That's insane. But it worked out great because you helped me see things more clearly. I appreciate that. Gerald stood up abruptly. No, son, you don't understand. We don't actually think those things. We believe in equality and justice. We were playing a role to see how you'd react. I smiled at him. And I failed your test, didn't I? I didn't agree with you enthusiastically enough. So now you're inviting me back to do what exactly? Give me another chance? Let me prove I'm one of the good ones? The accusation hung in the air. Vivian's hands were shaking. That's not... We weren't trying to. We just wanted to make sure you were someone who would stand up for what's right. I leaned forward. By making me sit through a dinner where you performed bigotry? By forcing Maya to hear her own parents spew racist garbage? What kind of progressive people do that? What did you think you were testing exactly? Maya stood up so suddenly her chair scraped loudly against the floor. You've been testing all my boyfriends? You put me through that nightmare dinner on purpose? Her voice was rising. Do you have any idea how devastating it was to hear you say those things? I cried for 3 days, thinking my parents were secretly racist this whole time. Vivienne reached for her. Sweetheart, it was just to protect you, to make sure you weren't dating someone with hidden prejudices. Maya jerked away. By pretending to have hidden prejudices yourselves? How does that make any sense? I watched this unfold with grim satisfaction while maintaining my confused, slightly hurt expression. So everyone's upset with me because I agreed with what you said? I asked innocently. I'm getting mixed messages here. Gerald looked at me with dawning realization spreading across his face. You knew, he said slowly. You figured out it was a test. I let the mask drop completely, my expression shifting from confused to coldly furious. Of course I figured it out, I said quietly, because unlike you, I actually researched the people I was about to meet. I pulled out my phone and brought up Vivian's LinkedIn, your board position at the Racial Equity Alliance. I swiped to Gerald's company bio, your mentorship program for minority entrepreneurs, your donation records to the NAACP and SPLC. You're not racist. You're wealthy white liberals who think you're so enlightened that you can play act bigotry as a fun little test. Do you have any idea how fucked up that is? Vivian sank back into her chair. Maya was staring at me now, with a different expression, something between respect and concern. Gerald's face had gone from red to white. We were just trying to protect our daughter, he said weakly. I stood up, and the movement made them all flinch slightly. Protect her from what, exactly? From dating someone who might not pass your ideological purity test? Let me tell you what you actually did. You subjected your daughter to hours of racist rhetoric that traumatized her. You created a situation where her boyfriend had to choose between maintaining politeness with potential future in-laws and aggressively challenging bigotry. You used racism as a prop, as a tool for your little social experiment, without any consideration for how degrading and disgusting that is. I paused, letting that sink in. And then when I did exactly what you wanted me to do at that first dinner, when I pushed back and argued and presented facts, you decided it wasn't enough. You needed to give me another chance. Why? Did I not perform outrage to your satisfaction? Was I too polite in my disagreement? Did I fail to call you racist loudly enough? Vivian was crying now, and I felt a flicker of guilt before remembering the cruelty of what they'd done. We made a terrible mistake, she said. We thought we were being responsible parents, making sure Maya was with someone who shared our values. But you do share our values, I said, my voice hard. That's what makes this so much worse. You're not actually bigots who I could write off and avoid. You're supposedly good people who thought it was acceptable to weaponize racism as a test. Do you understand how many actual racists do exactly what you did? How they say terrible things and then claim they were joking or testing people when they get called out? You gave yourselves plausible deniability while putting everyone around you through hell. Maya had tears streaming down her face, but she was nodding. Gerald looked like he'd been punched. I wanted to hammer the point home completely. Here's what really disturbs me, I continued. You've apparently done this test with multiple people Maya has dated. How many of them do you think actually passed? How many perfectly decent people did you alienate because they didn't perform their anti-racism to your exact specifications? How many relationships did you sabotage? And what about the possibility that someone might actually agree with your fake bigotry? What if one of Maya's boyfriends had been secretly racist, and you gave him an opening to express it under the cover of agreeing with what you said? You created a situation where racism could be normalized, even temporarily, in your own home. What kind of sick social experiment is that? Vivian was sobbing openly now. We never thought of it that way. We were so focused on protecting Maya that we didn't consider the implications. That's the problem, I said. You didn't think. You had this clever idea, and you were so confident in your own progressiveness that you didn't stop to examine how harmful it was. Maya spoke for the first time in several minutes, her voice shaking with emotion. How many? She asked her parents. How many of my boyfriends did you do this to? Gerald and Vivian looked at each other. 5, Gerald admitted. Over the years. Since you were in college. Maya's laugh was bitter and painful. 5. You traumatized me 5 separate times to test men I was dating. Did it ever occur to you to just trust my judgment? To believe that I wouldn't date someone with reprehensible views? Vivian reached out. We've always been worried about you being taken advantage of, about men hiding who they really are. Maya shook her head. So instead of teaching me to trust myself and recognize red flags, you created fake ones. You made me doubt you, doubt myself, doubt everyone around me. Do you know how much therapy I've been in trying to figure out why I have such bad anxiety around meeting parents, around family dinners, around conflict? You did this. You created this. I sat back down, my anger cooling into something more calculated. I want you to understand something, I said to Gerald and Vivian. I'm not actually racist. Every single thing I said tonight was me playing a role, showing you exactly what you did to Maya and to me and to every other person you've tested. The difference is that I'm not pretending this was some noble test of character. I did it to make you feel the horror of sitting across from someone expressing bigoted views. I did it to make you understand the cruelty of your little experiment. How did it feel when I was agreeing with your fake racism, when I was taking it further than you'd gone? Did it make you sick? Did it make you want to scream? Because that's how I felt at that first dinner. That's how Maya felt. The room was silent, except for Vivienne's quiet crying. Gerald looked at me with something like respect, mixed with shame. You made your point, he said heavily. Maya stood up again, her decision clearly made. We're leaving, she said to me. Then she turned to her parents. I don't know when I'll be ready to see you again. You need to seriously examine what you've done and why you thought it was acceptable. This isn't about protecting me. This is about you needing to control who I date and how they think. I'm an adult. I make my own choices. And right now, I'm choosing to leave. We walked to the door together, and I could hear Vivian calling after us, pleading for us to stay and talk this through. Maya ignored her. In the car, she sat behind the wheel for a long moment before starting the engine. She started, then stopped. I don't even know what that was. I apologized for my performance, explaining that I'd figured out it was a test and wanted to show them how harmful their experiment was. She shook her head. Don't apologize. You did in 2 minutes what I couldn't do in years, which is make them actually see themselves. We drove to her apartment in silence, and once inside, she collapsed onto her couch. I've been so fucked up about my parents for so long, she said quietly. I could never understand why I'd leave feeling terrible after family dinners, why I was always anxious about introducing them to anyone important in my life. Now I know it's because they've been staging interventions disguised as dinner parties. I sat next to her, and she leaned into me. How did you figure it out? She asked. I explained my research, the inconsistency between her description and their behavior, the too perfect setup of the second dinner. She nodded slowly. I should have seen it, but I was so devastated by what they said that I couldn't think straight. That's the cruelty of it, I said. They put you in an impossible position, made you doubt everything you thought you knew about them. That kind of manipulation is deeply harmful. Maya's phone started ringing incessantly. Her mother, her father, texts coming through rapid fire. She turned off her phone. I can't deal with them right now, she said. I need time to process what they've done. We spent the rest of the evening talking through the implications, the patterns of control and manipulation that she was now seeing clearly. She told me about other incidents over the years that she'd dismissed as her parents being overprotective, but that now seemed like tests or control tactics. They've always needed to approve of everything in my life, she said. My major in college, my career choices, where I lived, who I dated. And I let them, because I thought they just wanted what was best for me. But it wasn't about what was best for me. It was about them maintaining control and feeling superior about their judgment. I listened and held her while she worked through years of manipulation, and I felt my anger at her parents intensify. The next morning, Maya decided she needed to confront them in writing before she could face them in person. She spent hours drafting an email that laid out exactly how their test had affected her, the damage it had done to her ability to trust, the betrayal she felt at discovering years of manipulation. She showed me the draft, and I suggested only minor changes, mainly encouraging her to be even more specific about the harm caused. The email was powerful and clear, and when she hit send, I could see the relief on her face mixed with grief. I'm mourning who I thought my parents were, she said. I'm mourning the relationship I thought we had. I told her that was valid, that grief for the loss of an illusion was real grief. She asked if I thought she was overreacting, and I assured her she absolutely wasn't, that her parents' behavior was manipulative and harmful, regardless of their intentions. The response from her parents came within an hour. A long email from Vivienne that was equal parts defensive justification and tearful apology. She insisted they'd been trying to protect Maya, that they'd seen friends' children hurt by partners with hidden prejudices, that they'd only wanted to ensure Maya was with someone who truly shared their values. She apologized for the execution, but not really for the concept, still maintaining that the test itself had been well-intentioned. Maya read it and felt her anger spike again. She doesn't get it, Maya said. She's still defending the test itself, just apologizing for how it made me feel. That's not a real apology. I agreed and suggested she not respond yet, to let them sit with her original email and see if they could do better. Gerald's email arrived an hour after Vivian's, shorter and more direct. It acknowledged that the test was wrong, that they'd been arrogant and controlling, and that he was ashamed. Maya showed it to me and said at least her father seemed to grasp the severity. Over the next week, Maya's parents continued trying to reach her through various means. Phone calls that went to voicemail, texts that went unanswered, even a letter delivered by mail that Maya read and then set aside. They're not actually listening, she observed. They're just trying different approaches to get me to forgive them and move on. I asked what she wanted from them, and she thought for a long moment. I want them to actually understand what they did wrong. Not just apologize because I'm upset, but genuinely see why their test was harmful and manipulative. And I want them to commit to change, to actually work on their controlling behavior. I told her those were reasonable expectations and that she should communicate them clearly. She drafted another email, this one outlining what she needed to see before she'd consider rebuilding the relationship with boundaries and consequences if they violated those boundaries. Maya's friends started reaching out, having heard from her parents that there was a family conflict. Her mother had apparently called Maya's closest friends to ask them to intervene, to convince Maya to forgive and reconcile. The friends were confused and concerned, not understanding what had happened. Maya decided to tell them the full story, and their reactions ranged from shocked to angry to supportive. One friend, Keisha, said she'd known Maya's parents were controlling but had no idea it went this deep. Another friend, David, offered to go with Maya to family therapy if her parents agreed to attend. The solidarity helped Maya feel less alone, and she started opening up more about other ways her parents had controlled and manipulated her over the years. Patterns emerged of them undermining her confidence, making her doubt her own judgment, and positioning themselves as the ultimate arbiters of what was right for her life. 2 weeks after the dinner, Maya's parents sent a joint email proposing family therapy with a counselor who specialized in parent-adult-child relationships. They said they'd been doing their own therapy individually and together, working to understand their controlling behavior and the harm it had caused. They acknowledged that the racist test had been cruel and that they'd subjected Maya to emotional abuse disguised as protection. The email was vulnerable and specific, addressing the actual issues rather than dancing around them. Maya read it several times before showing it to me. "This feels different," she said, "like they're actually getting it." I read through carefully and agreed that the language suggested genuine insight rather than performative apology. Maya decided to accept the therapy offer but insisted on specific ground rules and the right to walk away if they backslid into manipulation. The first family therapy session was scheduled for a Friday evening. Maya asked if I wanted to come and I said I'd support whatever she decided, but that this was her family dynamic to navigate. She decided to go alone initially, wanting to work through the parent-child issues without the complication of me being there. She came back 3 hours later, looking exhausted, but somewhat hopeful. "The therapist is good," she reported. She didn't let them minimize or justify. She kept bringing them back to the impact of their behavior on me. My parents cried a lot. They talked about their own childhoods, their fears about me being hurt, their need for control. It doesn't excuse anything, but at least I understand the pathology better. I asked if she thought they could actually change. She said the therapist believed so if they committed to the work, but that it would take time and consistent effort. I met with Gerald and Vivian for the first time since the disastrous dinner about a month into their family therapy. They'd asked through Maya if I'd be willing to talk with them, and I'd agreed on the condition that it was at a neutral location with Maya present. We met at a coffee shop and they looked smaller somehow, less imposing. Gerald started by saying they owed me an apology that had nothing to do with repairing their relationship with Maya. "What we did to you was wrong," he said. "We put you in an impossible situation and then judged you for how you handled it. And then when you turned it back on us, when you showed us what we'd done, we got angry instead of understanding. I'm sorry." Vivian added that watching me perform agreement with their fake racism had been one of the most horrifying experiences of her life, and that it had finally made her understand how cruel their test had been. I accepted their apologies but told them I needed them to understand something. You tested whether I'd stand up to racism, I said, but you never tested whether you would. You performed bigotry so convincingly that if Maya hadn't known you differently, if a stranger had witnessed that dinner, they would have walked away thinking you were actual racists. You normalized racist rhetoric in your home, even temporarily. You proved that you could perform bigotry without apparent discomfort. That should disturb you more than whether I passed your test. Gerald looked stricken. You're right, he said quietly. We were so focused on judging you that we never examined what it said about us that we could even conceive of that test, let alone execute it multiple times. Vivienne wiped her eyes. We've been working on understanding our white liberalism, our performative allyship, all the ways we've centered ourselves, instead of actually doing the work. It's been painful. The conversation continued for another hour, covering the nuances of their behavior and its impact. They asked thoughtful questions about how I'd figured out the test and what had made me decide to perform agreement rather than simply calling them out. I explained that I'd wanted them to feel the full weight of what they'd done, to experience the horror of sitting across from someone expressing bigoted views. I wanted you to be afraid that you'd succeeded, I said, that your test had actually converted me, or worse, that it had given permission to someone who was already racist. They needed to sit with that fear to understand the stakes of their experiment. Maya reached across the table and squeezed my hand. By the end of the conversation, I felt like we'd established a foundation for potentially moving forward, though I made clear that my relationship with them would depend entirely on their continued growth and their treatment of Maya. Maya's parents committed fully to their therapy and to changing their patterns. They started educating themselves genuinely about racism, white privilege, and performative allyship. They joined actual activist groups and did real work rather than just attending fundraiser galas. They learned about trauma and control and began understanding how their behavior had damaged their daughter. The process took months, and there were setbacks where old patterns emerged and had to be addressed, but slowly, painfully, they started to change. Maya's relationship with them shifted from the enmeshed, controlled dynamic to something healthier with boundaries. She learned to recognize when they were slipping into manipulation and to call it out immediately. They learned to respect her autonomy and to trust her judgment even when it differed from theirs. It wasn't perfect and probably never would be, but it was honest. About 6 months after the dinner incident, Maya and I were at her parents' house for a genuine family meal. The atmosphere was different now, less performative and more authentic. Gerald made a joke that fell flat and immediately apologized rather than doubling down. Vivienne asked about my work in a way that showed genuine interest rather than fishing for judgment fodder. Over dinner, they asked me about my family and my childhood, real questions meant to know me rather than to test me. At one point, Gerald brought up the dinner incident himself. I want you to know, we told our friends what we did, he said. We explained the racist test and why it was wrong. Several of them admitted they'd done similar things, testing their kids' partners in manipulative ways. We're trying to be a resource for other parents who might be tempted to do something similar. I appreciated the accountability and said so. Later that evening, Vivienne pulled me aside while Maya and Gerald were doing dishes. Thank you, she said quietly, for loving our daughter enough to show us what we were doing to her, for being brave enough to confront us in a way that couldn't be dismissed or rationalized. I know we hurt you too, and I'm grateful you gave us the opportunity to make amends. I told her that I hadn't done it for them, that I'd done it for Maya, and honestly for my own satisfaction, but I was glad something positive had come from it. She nodded. We don't deserve the grace you and Maya have shown us, she said, but we're trying to earn it every day. I could see she meant it, and while I wasn't sure we'd ever be close, I believed we could have a respectful relationship built on honesty rather than games. Maya and I talked on the drive home about how surreal it was to have a normal family dinner with her parents. It felt like meeting them for the first time, she said. Like the people I always thought they were are actually showing up now. I asked if she trusted it would last, and she said she was cautiously optimistic. They're doing the work, she said, and they're accepting accountability when they slip up. That's more than a lot of parents ever do. We talked about our own future, about how we'd handle conflicts and control issues if they arose in our relationship. We committed to honesty and direct communication, to never testing each other or playing games with serious issues. We promised to call out manipulation and to value truth over comfort. The conversation felt foundational, like we were building something deliberately, rather than just letting it happen. A year after the infamous dinner, Maya's parents hosted a dinner party and invited several couples, including some of their friends who'd admitted to doing similar tests with their children's partners. The stated purpose was to have an honest conversation about parenting adult children, control, and the damage done by these manipulative tests. Maya and I attended, curious about how it would go. Gerald opened by telling the full story of what they'd done, including my response and the aftermath. He didn't minimize or justify, just laid out the facts and the consequences. Then he talked about what they'd learned in therapy and through their own education. Several other parents shared their own stories of testing partners, and the room grew heavy with recognition of the harm they'd caused. One mother broke down describing how her test had destroyed her son's relationship with a wonderful woman who'd failed to perform her values correctly under pressure. The conversation shifted to discussing why progressive parents felt compelled to test their children's partners in the first place. Themes emerged around fear of being judged by association, need for control disguised as protection, and a fundamental lack of trust in their children's judgment. Several parents admitted they'd never taught their kids how to recognize red flags or trust their own instincts because the parents had been too busy trying to control outcomes. Maya spoke powerfully about her experience, about the trauma of hearing her parents spout racist views even temporarily, about the years of therapy needed to untangle the manipulation. She challenged the room to consider what message these tests sent to their children. That you don't trust us, she said. That you think you're better judges of character than we are. That passing your ideological purity test matters more than our happiness or agency. The room was silent, several people crying quietly. By the end of the evening, every parent in attendance had committed to stopping manipulative tests and to working on trusting their adult children's judgment. They talked about having honest conversations about values and concerns rather than staging elaborate scenarios. They discussed seeking therapy to address their own control issues rather than projecting them onto their kids. Maya's parents had created something unexpected out of their terrible mistake, a support group and accountability network for parents trying to unlearn controlling behavior. On the drive home, Maya said she never thought her parents' racism test would lead to this kind of community reckoning. I laughed and said manipulation has a way of spreading when it's normalized, and that exposing it in one family had revealed how widespread it was. We agreed that something good had come from something terrible, though the terrible part could never be fully erased or excused. 2 years after everything started, Maya and I got engaged. Her parents' reaction was genuine joy, without the manipulation or control that had characterized their earlier behavior. They offered to help with wedding planning, but made clear they'd respect whatever we decided. The proposal itself was simple, just the two of us on a hiking trail where we'd had one of our early dates. When we told her parents over dinner, Vivian cried happy tears, and Gerald hugged me with what felt like real affection. No test this time, he said wryly. We trust your judgment completely, Maya. We always should have. Maya smiled and said that was the best wedding gift they could give her. Planning proceeded smoothly, and while there were normal family tensions around guest lists and logistics, there were no power plays or manipulation attempts. Her parents had learned to offer opinions without demands and to accept decisions without judgment. The wedding was beautiful, held at a vineyard in early autumn. During his speech, Gerald addressed the racist test incident directly, which surprised most of the guests who didn't know the story. He talked about what he and Vivian had learned about control, trust, and allowing their daughter to be her own person. He acknowledged publicly that they'd been terrible parents in many ways, but that Maya and I had given them the opportunity to become better. It was vulnerable and honest, and several people came up to me afterward to ask what he'd been referring to. I gave them the abbreviated version and watched their faces register shock and recognition. A few admitted they'd done similar things with their own children's partners. I suggested they talk to Maya's parents about the support group they'd formed. By the reception's end, several new families had committed to joining and working on their own controlling behaviors. Maya and I honeymooned in Japan, and for 2 weeks we didn't think about family dynamics or tests or manipulation. We explored temples and ate incredible food and talked about our future with genuine excitement rather than anxiety. When we returned, we had dinner with her parents, and they asked about the trip without trying to control the conversation or judge our choices. The relationship had reached a sustainable equilibrium, not perfect, but workable. They'd never get back the years of enmeshed control, but they could build something different going forward. Maya told me later that she'd finally stopped grieving her old relationship with her parents and had accepted the new one. It's actually better, she said, built on truth instead of performance. I agreed. Honesty might be messier than the illusion of perfect progressive parenting, but it was infinitely more valuable. 3 years out, Maya's parents published an op-ed in a major newspaper about their racist test and what they'd learned. They titled it, How Progressive Parents Weaponize Social Justice to Control Their Children. The piece went viral, sparking conversations about performative progressivism, parenting adult children, and the harm done by manipulative tests. They received both praise for their honesty and criticism for having done something so harmful in the first place. They accepted both with grace, responding to critics by acknowledging that yes, they'd been terrible, and that was exactly why they were speaking out to prevent other parents from making similar mistakes. Several universities invited them to speak about parenting, control, and accountability. They always brought Maya and me, insisting we tell the full story, including the damage caused. The speaking engagements led to more parents coming forward with their own test stories, and the support group expanded into a national network. Maya went back to school for a counseling degree, specializing in family systems and control dynamics. She wanted to help other people who'd been subjected to manipulative parenting, to give them tools to recognize and address it. Her parents funded her education, which felt like appropriate restitution. I watched her thrive in the program, bringing her own experience to case studies and research. For her thesis, she studied the long-term psychological effects of parental testing and manipulation on adult children. The results were stark, showing measurable impacts on anxiety, trust, and relationship formation. She presented her findings at a conference where her parents sat in the front row, visibly uncomfortable with the data but not defensive. They'd learned to sit with their discomfort, to let themselves be criticized without lashing out or justifying. That growth, more than anything, convinced me they'd actually changed. Now, 5 years later, we're expecting our first child. Maya's parents are excited but notably different grandparents in waiting than they were as parents. They ask how they can support us rather than trying to dictate parenting approaches. They've been reading books on healthy grandparent boundaries and attending therapy specifically about not repeating their controlling patterns with a new generation. We had a conversation early on about our values and what kind of relationships we wanted our child to have with grandparents. Maya was direct, telling them that any testing or manipulation of our child would result in immediate supervised visits only. They accepted the boundary without argument and promised they'd learned their lesson. I believed them mostly, but we'd stay vigilant regardless. Trust is earned continuously, not granted once, and maintained automatically. Last month, Maya's parents celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary with a party where they took time to acknowledge the people who'd held them accountable when they'd gone wrong. They thanked Maya for not giving up on them despite having every reason to walk away. They thanked me for showing them what they'd done in a way they couldn't dismiss or rationalize. They thanked their therapist and their support group, and the friends who'd been honest with them even when it was uncomfortable. They framed the growth as ongoing, emphasizing they still work daily to unlearn controlling patterns. The speech was moving, and afterward, several people told us they'd never seen parents take such thorough accountability. Maya cried and said she was proud of them, which seemed impossible 5 years ago. Growth takes time, humility, and consistent effort, but her parents had proven it was possible even after severe breaches of trust. Standing at that anniversary party, watching Maya's parents interact with genuine warmth rather than performative correctness, I thought about how far we'd all come. From a dinner table where fake racism was used as a test to a community of parents learning healthier ways to love their adult children. From trauma and manipulation to accountability and growth. From performance to authenticity. The path hadn't been easy or quick, but it had been worth traveling. And when our child asks someday how we knew Grandma and Grandpa were safe people despite their past, we'll tell them the whole truth. We'll explain that good people can do terrible things, and that real accountability means acknowledging harm, doing the work to change, and accepting that trust must be rebuilt rather than demanded. And we'll teach them that they never need to perform their values for anyone, that authenticity and honesty matter more than passing tests. Those lessons, hard-won from Maya's parents' mistakes, will be part of their legacy, not the racism test itself, but what came after. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.